Good afternoon and welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts program, Art in Context. I'm Linda Friedlander, Head of Education. Please note that the program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature on your navigation bar to gather your questions, and we will attempt to answer them at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your toolbar. Yale University acknowledges that the indigenous people and nations have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Lucinda Lax joined the Yale Center for British Art as curator of paintings and sculpture in January 2023. She brings extensive experience from the National Galleries of Scotland, where she was senior curator of portraiture. At the NGS, Lax undertook innovative redisplays of the gallery's historic collections, one which was widely recognized for introducing critical debates about colonialism and Scotland's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Lax will lead the reinstallation of the center's permanent collection, represented in new displays on the 4th floor and in spaces throughout the building, in time for the museum's reopening in 2024. She is also preparing a major exhibition on the work of J.M.W. Turner to coincide with the 250th anniversary of his birth in 2025. Dr. Lax will discuss the Blacksmiths Shop, the earliest and most ambitious of 5 paintings by Joseph Wright of Derby that depict iron forges being worked at night. This talk will show how to really engage with the painting on its own terms. Viewers must acknowledge that Wright and his contemporaries operated with a very different understanding of the nature and purposes of, quote, art and our own. By taking this into account, we can develop a new approach that promises to shed fresh light not only on Wright's painting and its place in his wide career, but also on the very nature of artistic practice at the dawn of the modern age. Lucinda?
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you to everybody who's joining me today for this webinar. It's great to be able to talk to you about this very fascinating painting in the YCBA's collection. Early in the 1760s, an obscure young painter in a prosperous but distinctly provincial city in the British Midlands turned from his usual practice as a portraitist. The painter was Joseph Wright of Derby. The painting was a girl reading a letter by candlelight with a young man looking over her shoulder, his first known attempt at a night piece. It is an accomplished work, but hardly an innovative one. Its overall focus and handling on candlelight effects recall the contemporary works of Henry Robert Morland and Thomas Fry. It also seems to draw inspiration from the evocative candlelight works of the 17th century Dutch painter Gottfried Sulkin. Wright would go on to produce a long series of such night pieces. Unlike Fry and Sulkin, however, Wright was not content to simply produce multiple small-scale pictures of this kind. Within a few years of this first experiment, Wright began to use the basic idea of subjects performing tasks in artificial light to take his practice in unexpected and increasingly ambitious directions. The first sign of Wright's growing concern, even obsession, with the genre is his celebrated 3 persons viewing the Gladiator by candlelight of around 1764-5, which you can see in this slide here. This time, instead of simply showing 2 figures posed in a darkened space, Wright focused his composition on a group of 3 connoisseurs. They are shown studying a small model of the Borghese Gladiator and comparing its merits to a 17th century print of the same sculpture. Then almost immediately after came the 2 paintings that were to secure Wright's reputation, both with scientific themes. The first, from 1766, is a philosophy lecturing on the orrery. There is now an even more marked increase in compositional complexity, with 7 seated spectators watching a godlike lecturer tracing out the motions of the solar system as represented by a clockwork mechanical model. The second, an experiment on a bird in the air pump of 1768, shows another lecturer, this time suffocating a bird as a vacuum is created in a bell jar. The figures are still more numerous again, 10 in place of 8, and are shown with varied expressions and attitudes that communicate an impressive range of human emotions. Strikingly, there is also an additional light source in the form of the distant moon, which can be glimpsed through the window to the far right. These fascinating, even mesmerizing paintings have come to dominate our perception of Wright. Yet they paved the way for further night pieces of still greater elaboration. The first is an Academy by Lamplight of 1769, of which the finest version is here at the YCBA. In it, we see a group of boys and young men. Evidently aspiring artists, they are contemplating and drawing a sculpture, the nymph with a shell, from the Villa Borghese. Although it has fewer figures than the air pump and reverts to a single light source, it is the first night piece where the figures are shown at full length. But it was in his next great night piece that Wright's ambition in this genre reached its apogee. The Blacksmiths Shop, also in the collection here at YCBA, was completed in 1771. Like the Academy, it centres on the portrayal of multiple full-length figures, but which this time form 2 distinct figural groups instead of one. The first clusters around 3 blacksmiths who occupy the centre of the image. The first of these is shown with his back to us, bracing his body as he strikes his hammer against the hot iron on the anvil, sparks flying in the process. The central figure, meanwhile, has one arm raised while the other rests on his hip. We can guess that he is holding a pair of tongs, ready to turn the iron for the next blow. The third blacksmith, who dominates the scene, braces his body as he lifts a hammer in readiness to take over the work of his first companion. To the right of the blacksmiths, we see 2 boys. One turns away in pain, apparently caught out by the shower of sparks. The other, his hands in his pockets, watches the spectacle with rapt attention. Immediately to their left, and seemingly lost in thought or drifting into slumber, is an elderly man also holding a hammer. Then to the far left of the painting, a further group of 3 men can be glimpsed through an open archway. A farrier shoes a horse, watched by an elegant man bending forwards. Finally, behind them, we see a figure in a jockey or hunt cap, presumably a groom. In total, there are 9 highly individualized full-length figures in the painting, to which must be added the 2 horses and dog that form part of the second group. No less remarkably, we now have no fewer than 3 light sources, not only the glow of the forge and the candle that illuminates the work of the farrier, but also, as in the air pump, the silvery light cast by the moon on the roof and walls of the forge itself. The Blacksmiths Shop, then, is by far the most compositionally complex and technically ambitious of Wright's night pieces. Curiously enough, however, the pioneering scholar of Wright's work, Benedict Nicholson, had little to say about this painting. According to Nicholson, the orrery and air pump were the greater achievements. They were both microcosms of Enlightenment culture and icons of artistic innovation. The forge paintings, by contrast, are simply variations on their predecessors, continuing the focus on industrial and technological themes and on dramatic light effects. There is nothing, he writes, in the forge pictures that had not been anticipated in embryo in the scientific scenes. David Sulkin, perhaps the most influential recent interpreter of 18th century British art, is more respectful. Far from seeing the blacksmith's forge as a mere variant on the orrery and air pump, he acknowledges in Wright's painting something new and important in its own right. Sulkin's starting point is the discovery, made in the 1990s, that Wright used gold leaf as the base for his depiction of the glowing ingot at the centre of the Yale painting. On the one hand, this is a clever device, intended to reflect light through the paint and so intensify the ingot's effect of light and heat. But by incorporating something as precious as gold into the representation of iron, Wright's art becomes a kind of alchemy that transforms the previously despised and low manual labour of the smith into something worthy of dignity and respect. In doing so, Wright, claims Sulkin, emerges as a modernising figure who explicitly rejected the intellectual conception of the liberal artist. Instead, Wright embraced the identity of an industrious craftsman whose ingenious labour gave moral, economic, and social value to the products of his brush. A very different reading comes from Matthew Brusque, author of the most recent major monograph on Wright. For Brusque, the artist is a more conservative and emotionally darker figure. In his view, the smith is represented not to dignify the art of labour, but to bring to mind the eternal rhythms of nature, of birth, childhood, the labours of adulthood, senescence, and finally death, each cycle beginning anew with every succeeding generation. Brusque builds much of his case on the remarkable ruinous setting of the Blacksmiths Shop. Although an apparently English scene, it takes place in the remains of an ancient Roman temple with fluted pilasters and an elaborate arch surmounted by classical winged figures. The importance of the setting is confirmed, Brusque argues, by similar ruined buildings in a number of Wright's other forged paintings, notably the Farrier's Shop, also completed in 1771. These can be interpreted as a symbol of the transience of human pretensions to grandeur and significance. For Brusque, this sense of the fragility of worldly things encourages the wealthy to look with sympathy upon the poor, recognizing that all belong to an ordered whole ordained by God. The nation, Brusque writes, was a sympathetic community with each class taking its allotted part. Both Sulkin's and Brusque's interpretations are certainly impressive in the way that they marshal evidence and argument to support their distinctive views of Wright's intentions. And they are surely right to give much more detailed attention to the Blacksmiths Shop than Nicholson. But the enlightened and laborious Wright, presented by Sulkin, contrasts strongly with the backward-looking, hierarchical alternative advocated by Brusque. Two such contrasting visions of Wright's painting can hardly both be right, but it is also difficult to imagine that both are entirely wrong. Sulkin's claim that Wright endows his labourers with an unusual degree of dignity surely captures something real and important about the Blacksmiths Shop. At the same time, there appears to be little good reason to disregard Brusque's reading of the ruin as a signifier of worldly transience. Is there any way, then, to bring together these apparently contradictory insights? In the rest of my talk today, I hope to make the case they can, in fact, be reconciled, but only if we pay more attention to what art actually meant to 18th century artists. Although it has received remarkably little attention from art historians, there are good reasons to think that the concept of art, as we understand it, was still quite alien to Wright and to most of his contemporaries. For us, art is primarily a mass noun, bringing together under a single term the so-called fine arts of painting, drawing, and sculpture, and often the performing arts as well. More generally, it represents a specific set of practices that have in common the use of imagination to develop representations that are apprehended by an audience. But if we turn to 18th century dictionaries and encyclopedias, we find quite different definitions. From Dr. Johnson's great dictionary, we learn that art is the power of doing something not taught by nature and instinct. As to walk is natural, to dance is an art. Art also equates to a trade and to artfulness, skill, dexterity. And on similar lines, it is also related to cunning, and a little more surprisingly, speculation, the act of comprehending something in the mind. Even more illuminating, perhaps, is the definition offered in James Barclay's complete and universal dictionary of 1774. Art, noun, an abstract or metaphysical term, implying a collection of certain rules from observation and experience by which anything may be performed or any end obtained. Barclay goes on to suggest that art is primarily about applying rule-governed ingenuity to making things. Barclay also considered the word a synonym for a trade, cunning, artfulness, speculation. It is striking then that in spite of their differences, both Johnson and Barclay completely omit any definition of art that corresponds to our primary usage of the term. Indeed, the evidence presented in the Oxford English Dictionary suggests that it was not until as late as the mid-19th century that the word gained wide currency in its modern sense. A second important point is Johnson's and Barclay's common emphasis on rule-bound learned practice for making or performing things. It is this, I think, that would have shaped Wright's own sense of what it was to be an artist. I would like to suggest that for Wright, this sense of his profession remained quite fundamental. In this sense, I suspect Sulkin is right to see in Wright's forge pictures a respectful acknowledgement of kinship between his and the blacksmith's laborious arts. But contrary to Sulkin, I would suggest that Wright's underlying emphasis is not on labour per se, but on skill. It is telling, for example, that Sulkin supports his interpretation with a passage from Hume, which he presents as a paean to labour. Read it carefully, however, and it seems clear enough that it is fundamentally about accomplishment. Behold the artisan, Hume writes, who converts a rude and shapeless stone into a noble metal, and moulding that metal by his cunning hands, creates, as it were by magic, every weapon for his defence and every utensil for his convenience. He has not the skill from nature. Use and practice have taught it him. And if thou wouldest emulate his success, thou must follow his laborious footsteps. While Sulkin argues that the forge paintings are intended to rouse the viewer to acknowledge the virtues of industry, they are surely much more directly intended, both thematically and in their own superlative facture, to induce admiration for skill. Skill can indeed only be won at the cost of labour, but it is skill that is the real goal of laborious endeavour. If this is right, we can begin to see that the theme of the blacksmith shop relates far more closely than might at first seem to the academy by lamplight. While the blacksmith shop is directly about skillful making, in the academy we see the prior stage, that is to say, the acquisition of such skillfulness. Awed by the superlative productions of the past, the young students of drawing and painting are inspired to devote the time and effort needed to master their art. And we can, moreover, see the whole pattern of progressively increasing ambition in Wright's night pieces as a conscious pursuit and demonstration of growing skill. But how can a focus on skillful production, any more than on labour, have an innate affinity for the extraordinary ruinous setting of the blacksmith shop? I think the best way of making this clearer is to think of the famous dictum, ars longa vita brevis. Art is long, but life is short. This phrase has been interpreted in two quite different ways. One, and this is undoubtedly its original meaning, is that the acquisition of skill in an art takes a long time, so much so that we are often fated to remain mere learners. This brings to mind the academy, where we see youths beginning what we are clearly intended to infer will be a lengthy apprenticeship. It may also offer an explanation for the choice of figures in the main group in the Blacksmiths Shop. In addition to the smiths, who are in the prime of life, we see children and an old man. This surely is, if not perhaps in quite the form Brusque envisages, an allegory of the cycle of life. Childhood, adulthood, and old age succeed each other both in individual lives and in the endless cycle of the generations, and also the endless cycle of acquiring skill and knowledge before we are deprived of it by old age and death. But this need not exclude the alternative secondary interpretation. According to this, the phrase means that while life is short, the products of art endure. In other words, while human generations come and go, the objects that they make, even if themselves destined to eventual destruction, can nevertheless last for centuries or even millennia. Even ruins themselves, by their very nature, have this double signification. On the one hand, they embody loss and impermanence, yet ironically, they can only do so by virtue of their extraordinary durability. While the triumphs of Rome are long gone, the temple in the Blacksmith Shop seems to say, the buildings of the Romans continue to impress us with their scale and magnificence. And similarly, it is because of this endurance that the pupils in the academy can still draw inspiration from the Borghese nymph. Or the gentlemen connoisseurs appreciate the forms of the gladiator, whether in 2 or 3 dimensions. The subject of Wright's paintings, then, is art, but art in the 18th century and not the modern sense. His art, that of painting, is one of a great array of arts, all distinguished by the use of principles, precepts, and skilled practices to make new things. Time is short, and we must labour hard, and sometimes in vain, to acquire the necessary skill. But the result can endure and give use and pleasure for centuries or millennia. Skillful productions, then, rightfully command admiration. If this comes closer to the meaning that Wright intended, it might seem that we are robbing his images of the wide-ranging social and political significance that Sulkin and Brusque attribute to them. But I would suggest that the truth is more interesting. While in the later 18th century, painting still remained only one of many arts, it does seem that there was something special about a form of skill that was able to evoke so convincingly the whole visible world using nothing but cloth, oil, and pigment. And Wright himself, with his pattern of ever-increasing ambition and accomplishment in his representation of the effects of light, can be seen to have played a crucial role in the process by which the artistry of painters came to be identified with art itself. Not only this, however, if, as I have suggested, Wright was using his night pieces and the blacksmith's forge in particular to clearly and self-consciously articulate a vision of art as supremely skillful making, then he must have been an active and intentional agent in this process. And if that is indeed the case, these works offer us direct insight into the concepts and cultural processes from which the very idea of art, as we understand it, was subsequently made. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucinda. We have some time for questions. First, may I tell you that you have greetings from Derby, from Graham? Does that ring a bell?
It doesn't. I'm not sure I know.
Okay, his last name is Rowe. Anyhow, okay.
That's great though. Hello to Derby.
Right. Okay. Did Wright of Derby know George de la Tour's earlier work, and was this an influence?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know that we have a great deal of evidence of that, but I do suspect, and I mean, in a way, I sort of feel like I'm embarking on my research into Wright and his practice, and there are so many aspects of it that we just don't know. But I think that the more I'm looking into these paintings, the more I can see that he was absorbing influences from so many different sources. So I think that, you know, is a really interesting suggestion and something that I should certainly look into. And I think it's absolutely possible that he was, you know, thinking about the practices of these different artists and how he could incorporate them into his work to create something that would take his practice, you know, to the next level. So thank you for that. That very interesting. It's a really a great observation, really interesting question.
Someone is suggesting that perhaps the ruined setting is playing on the classic iconography of the Nativity and showing how industry has replaced religion. Your thoughts?
That's really interesting as well. Yeah, I mean, there's much to be made about the sort of setting in this painting, and indeed actually across the whole series of forged paintings that Wright creates, and how the setting kind of varies. And actually Brusque makes quite a lot of this, as I mentioned in the talk. I think this is a really interesting idea, actually, again, about how religion plays into it. Whether Wright is indeed suggesting that industry has supplanted religion, I'm not sure, because I think actually one thing I would argue is that in a way, I think the whole idea of religion is still very much part of these images. And in a sense, I think that's maybe kind of what I'm trying to suggest as well, that actually these things are kind of coexisting alongside one another. And I think that you get this sense of this kind of worldly order very much in the way that you get the groupings of figures, this sense of kind of a life cycle, generations coexisting within this very ancient setting. So I think it's a really interesting point, and it's something that, you know, we could look into, I think, in more detail when thinking about these paintings. But I would suggest that yeah, in a sense, the religion is not lost to me. I think it's still very much part of this idea of thinking about skill and this acquiring of skill as being part of this kind of great sort of worldly order, if that makes sense.
Yes. Viewers who are tuned in would like you to know that this painting of Derby is across the street right now at the Yale University Art Gallery in their special exhibition titled Crafting World Views, Art and Science in Europe, 1500 to 1800. A wonderful exhibition, and also a place where you can see this painting in person. Someone had a question about the idea that gold leaf in the painting is particularly intriguing. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, sure, Linda. So, I mean, again, that's really interesting. So there's a time, I think, actually, in Wright's early practice where he's really experimenting and thinking about how he can, you know, make more of these dramatic light effects and kind of what materials can he use to do this. And so actually in this instance, in the Yale painting, we get this this kind of moment in the center of the work where we have that glowing ingot, where actually he literally sandwiches a piece of gold leaf between the paint layers to create this sense of kind of reflection and this real sense of glow that's coming from the molten metal. It's something, interestingly, in the paper by David Sulkin that I referenced, he talks a lot about this, but he sees it as having a very kind of symbolic significance, in the sense that it's the idea of the artist kind of transforming iron into gold, and it's a way of kind of dignifying the labor of the smiths that we see in the image. But I actually think that in a sense, it's primarily a technical device. I think that's how I would see it. And that actually we see instances of this happening in some of Wright's other works from the late 60s as well, 1760s. So it's something that, you know, he's kind of playing with in these images. And then he departs from it and he moves away, and then he's kind of moving towards other things. But it's interesting, you know, it's interesting. And I think this is an aspect of the painting that I'm hoping at one point we can take it, we can bring it into the conservation studio here and look at it in more detail, because I'm sure that we can make, you know, quite a lot more of that too.
Thank you. And we have time for one more. A viewer is asking, was Wright of Derby successful in his own lifetime?
Yeah, absolutely. So he is actually, I think, one of the very rare instances or examples of an artist who engaged with the London art world, but he wasn't actually, you know, most of his career he was based in the provinces near his native Derby, and he had a very close circle of patrons. He was exhibiting regularly, and his output is hugely diverse. Actually, you just need to go to, well, our collection shows it if you look online, but also the great collection at Derby Museum as well, which is primarily, you know, the world's great collection of Wright of Derby's paintings. You can just see the, you know, the sheer diversity in his practice. And the fact that, you know, he was able to play to the interests of quite a few different patrons. So for sure, you know, he was highly successful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucinda, for your presentation. Thank you to our viewers who tuned in. And please join us in 2 weeks' time for another Art in Context. Thank you.